That's Debatable is sponsored by MB&G. MB&G is specialists in the esoteric world of vehicle and furniture warranty insurance, delivering quite marvellous customer service, prompt claims payment, and a highly developed understanding of how to deliver these products in a way that is both compliant with the regulations and attractive to customers. To find out more, call Paul Smith, the Managing Director, on 07887 501 441. That's 07887 501 441. Hello and welcome to That's Debatable, the weekly news podcast of the Free Speech Union, and welcome back to all of our listeners and to all of our viewers. And we should launch straight in, I think, Jan, into this week's smorgasbord of free speech issues drawn from the weekly newsletter, which is always a good read. If you don't get to the podcast, of course, and the monthly newsletter. We will start with a victory for the Free Speech Union. So we've talked before about the burning of the Koran, that there was a case where Greater Manchester Police actually revealed the name of someone who was being investigated for burning a Koran. And we were shocked that happened, because obviously that leads to death threats and real genuine threats against people's lives. But the good news is in a different case. So this is a case in Bradford, and a man who was arrested for burning a copy of the Quran will not face charges, and that follows intervention by us at the Free Speech Union. Now, this individual arrived in Britain as an asylum seeker. And of course, ironically, as is often the case in these stories, he was fleeing religious persecution in a Muslim majority country. And he uploaded a video of himself burning a Quran in a symbolic stand for freedom of speech and against Islamic extremism. But in this case, West Yorkshire Police reacted very swiftly. In this, he would have thought you would think they'd react swiftly to protect his right to protest, but no. They reacted swiftly to arrest him on suspicion of committing a criminal offence. We intervened immediately. We instructed a solicitor, and we covered the individual's legal fees. And after several months, so that again, there's a lot to be said about several months, how long this takes for the process to come to an end. The police have now told him they'll be taking no further action. Great news, but he should never have been arrested in the first place. And we've talked a lot about, as I said, about blasphemy laws in this context. But I was reading through an article by our colleague, Jan, Freddie, who is relentless in writing about all sorts of things. I keep spotting topics on different platforms that Freddie has written. So his pen never stops, I think. Anyhow, right at the end of this article that he's written, he says, and we'll put a link to the article in the show notes, he says a few things. First of all, he says how essential this case shows early intervention and dedicated advocacy is early on to resist these attempts to criminalize legitimate, though they may be provocative, forms of speech. But he then goes on about how much we're actually hearing about these cases. So he says, you're unlikely to hear much about cases like these in the mainstream media, not necessarily through overt suppression, but through editorial choices calibrated to humor the chattering classes without cutting quite so brutally to the multicultural quick. Yet, these cases deserve our time and our concern. It's only when people start to recognize the quiet resurgence of censorship in Britain, cloaked under the guise of enforcing public order and tackling hate crime, that it can be effectively resisted. And then he ends by saying that these two cases, the one in Manchester that I referenced, where there was a prosecution very quickly, and this other case with West Yorkshire Police, where there were no charges pressed. These should be remembered as instances where, the issue of free expression is not just a right-wing myth. This is actually genuinely, regularly happening, and it's happening to people who fled here to a place where they thought they might have freedom and the right to protest, and discovered in the most terrible of ways, that they absolutely didn't have that in the way they thought. So a lot that Freddie's put on paper there, and I would genuinely encourage any listener and any viewer to go and have a look at that. Have a look at that article. But yeah, I think that's good news, isn't it, Jan?
Yeah, it's great, and if we can succeed in defending people doing this, then logically we should be able to defend them saying other much less offensive things, because it obviously will be very offensive to some Muslims to see or know that a Quran has been burned to them. If to them it's a sacred text, that's how they view it, and they see him as being very antagonistic towards their religious beliefs, then that is almost the definition of offence, really, isn't it? It is offensive, but being offensive is not illegal, and it needs to be protected as a right. So it's very clear, and it's very good, I think. And also the fact that there's an act associated with the speech. So in a way, it's a speech act. Again, very helpful in clarifying things. He's not um, his protest involves an object, not a person. It's not directed at another person. It's not against. There's no kind of violent, even a pretense of violence or a threat of violence against another person. It's purely a symbolic act using an object as a prop, really. And so I think the clarity that can be achieved in these cases is really great. I don't know how he found us or whether we found him. I don't know whether you know that, but I know in some of these cases where we see a story coming up, we do our best to try to make contact with the person where we know that we are really well equipped to help them, but also where we recognise immediately now what's going to be a really important case. So this is great, and just shows what a position we're in to get in there really early, as you said.
Well, I also can't remember the exact origins of the case. As you know, Jan, I see a lot of what's happening because I'm helping to manage the systems and run the systems when people do contact us. So on many cases, I do see the sort of originating communication and then see it go on through the process. But what I do remember is that our case team in this case, as similarly in the other case, are doing a lot more than just getting in contact with a lawyer or whatever. There's a lot of reassurance of an individual who's going through that most terrible time and really scared, in this case, for their life. And I see the case in these cases, as you say, the sharp end of free expression. I think we see the case team operating really at their best and most effective to support people and to put them in a safer place as well. There's the safety element that really comes into play in this. So again, I don't fully know the origin, but just so pleased to see that we're able to make this kind of a difference at the sharp end of free speech. But we should move on to our second topic, Jan, which I know is one very close to your heart, and you have much to say and to share on. But I'll just give the background to this next topic for the episode, and it concerns the Employment Rights Bill. Many of our listeners and viewers will already be familiar with this, but the concern we have is Clause 18 of the government's proposed Employment Rights Bill. Because what it is effectively is a dangerous escalation in speech policing, but it's disguised as a way to protect vulnerable workers. What will it do? Well, it will force all British businesses, so we often use pubs as an example, but it's not just pubs, but all British businesses to monitor customer conversations, or they will risk being sued for third-party harassment of their employees. So the Worker Protection Act from last year, 2024, already makes employers liable for third-party sexual harassment of their employees. But what this Clause 18 does is it adds in a liability for non-sexual third-party harassment, or I always joke, Jan, I call it harassment, but that's just that's just a family joke. What I might get in trouble for, but it means things like offhand remarks, jokes, contentious political views. Those sorts of things could be perceived as harassment. And it won't just cover comments directed at employees. Workers will be able to sue over upsetting conversations between customers or members of the public that they merely overhear on the grounds that their protected characteristics ought to shield them from being harassed in that way. And they won't just be able to sue their employers for not doing enough to protect them, but for not doing enough to protect their colleagues. So the phrase that got used in the weekly newsletter that to describe this was turbocharging. This really is turbocharging the Equality Act. And the consequences, again, a phrase from this week's newsletter, is mind-boggling. And it is, Jan, you can play out and war game all sorts of different examples of the problems this will cause. The banter police, the banter bouncers, all the different sort of phrases that you can come up with for what businesses will need to put in place to protect their employees from this new harassment. So there's a little bit of background, Jan, but I know you have your own additional thoughts on this particular item.
Yeah, well, thanks. That's really helpful outlining of the legislation and what's being proposed. It's going to be discussed this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, I think, in the Commons. Is at report stage. But what it made me think of, it made me reflect on some of the pub cases that have occurred so far, and a couple of ones we are actually handling. So, and then another that happened more recently, which we're not involved in, as far as I know, but was nevertheless in the papers. So, the most I'll go through them because there's a sort of layering to the significance of these things. So there's a case in Belfast, which is chronologically the first one, which was where some people who'd attended Let Women Speak gender critical protest in Belfast then went to a pub afterwards. They were in the public area of the pub, and some of them had the equivalent of adult human female T-shirts on with writing on slogans. Somebody else had, what's the male gay version of that, whatever that is, I can't remember, adult male something or other.
I ought to know that, but I don't, Jan. I'm living in my normal cocoon of
yeah, which reinforces the idea that it's only women that have to define themselves. But anyway, because of those T-shirts, are not because of words spoken, but because of the words written on the T-shirts, some of them were then refused service by the bar staff, and this turned into a huge hoo-ha, which then resulted it's disputed at the moment, but possibly in some violence from the bar staff towards one of the customers, which is quite extraordinary. But that was based around sort of refusing service on the basis of these people's alleged offensiveness. Another one was the Brighton pub case, which probably people have heard of, where some people in Brighton were having a private meeting. They'd booked a private area of a pub. And when they started their discussion, which they have, and they were discussing lots of different topics, they meet regularly, and they've had no problems meeting in a different pub, but they'd moved to a new pub, and the pub called security and actually forcibly removed people from the pub on the basis of what they were saying as their private conversations, which couldn't be overheard in the rest of the pub. And so they were kicked out. And then when they were moved on to another pub, they couldn't get into that pub either because the security forces, which is a private security force, followed them and then prevented them gaining entry to another pub just where they wanted to go and have a drink and discuss what on earth had just happened to them. So there's those first two cases. And then the most recent one, which again, we're not involved in this one, but it is an interesting one, which was a pub in Nottingham where some women were having a drink. Some of them had definitely been to an event nearby to do with the sex, gender, trans issue. But two of the women went to get served at the bar, and they were refused service because another woman had been overheard by the staff apparently insulting the pride flag because what she said was, and it was the kind of more elaborate pride flag with every colour in it.
The progress flag, I think that one's cool.
Yeah, there was a conversation between two customers. It wasn't directed at the staff, as if they were responsible for putting the flag there. They weren't. It wasn't directed at anybody. It was a comment passed between two customers, as far as I know. But then, not only that, it was the two other customers who didn't say these things, who were then refused service because they were sort of lumped together. And it is. I mean, it's kind of interesting. It's like being lumped together as part of an ethnic group or something. You know, when there's lots of cases that come up at the moment where Irish travellers are refused service in pubs, and then people that are assumed to be Irish travellers can be refused service, and that kind of thing. And that thing of being lumped together, and assumptions being made about you
Well,
before you've said
we're all our groups. It's all
yeah.
who we are. But what I take away from those examples you've given, Jan, you've given 3 examples where it's already happening. So it's
Yeah.
already the case that not institutions, businesses, small businesses are running scared of their employees already, and going further to kind of curate their customer base, and to curate the people in their bars, and to, as you say, worryingly, have almost like a network with their security firm, so that the next pub down the road does the same thing. So, what do you think, Jan? And this might be a little bit provocative. What, is there any point worrying about the employment rights bill if it's already here? This is just enshrining something that's already happening. So, is it going to make a
Well,
difference?
yeah. Well, I think it is interesting. I think a lot of these speech restrictions, people already assume they're in place. People already probably assume it's illegal to burn the Koran, because that's the messaging that's been put out for the last, however, 20 years or so. So prior to the law, people are already operating as if it is the law. And what's happening in these pub cases prior to the Employment Rights Bill is that at least people are then fighting out retrospectively their rights to be served and to be in a semi-public space, using the Equality Act. So that's what will happen: is the existing Equality Act will be the thing that's being referred to, and these customers will say, "I'm discriminated against." So goodness knows what happens when, on the one, you'll still have those cases where people are retrospectively fighting back on the grounds of the Equality Act, but then you'll also have this Employment Rights Bill. So how on earth that fits together, I've got no idea.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, to answer my own question, Jan, there is a practical sense in which I think, yes, this is already in place. But the reality, I go back to what finding we have from the 2 Quran cases. The first case, there was a sort of, I plead guilty, and is quickly goes through the process, versus a case where someone comes to us early and we can defend them. Pleads not guilty. So having the law in place makes such a huge difference. And so therefore, putting this law in place in this way, through the Employment Rights Bill, is a very big problem. And to that point, there is this week, I think there's an opportunity for listeners, for viewers, to write into their MP to say, please, can we put a stop to this amendment, or article number 18? And I went to it. I went to it on the Parliament's website, or the government's website. And this section 18 of the bill is effectively a rewrite of Section 40 of the Equality Act 2010. So it just adds on this point about broadening the definition of harassment. So therefore, this harassment is then linked directly through Section 40 of the Equality Act 2010 to all the normal protected characteristics, which are already misinterpreted anyway. But the point is, that seems to be the way they're knitting together the Employment Rights Bill and the Equality Act 2010, which we always describe as being our greatest enemy and our greatest friend, don't we, in our work? It seems so often to have created this class of protected characteristics on the one hand, but on the other hand, it is really our only way of attacking some of the new ideology, especially when it comes to gender critical ideology, gender ideology, and the fact that gender critical beliefs are protected now, thanks to Maya, for starters. So it is a mishmash, but I do come back to that point, Jan. The law really does matter in this
Oh,
sense.
absolutely. No, it really does. And I think all of these cases where we're forcing clarity and in existing law, and then obviously it helps us in a way to clarify why and spot new law. So when obviously having Toby in the Lords is great, because just being able to really, our kind of instincts for spotting where these future free speech threats will arise when these very complex bills are proposed. I mean, this Employment Rights Bill has got loads of stuff in it. It's got nothing to do with speech, and little composites of amendments to other acts that exist, and all of this kind of stuff. So just being able to kind of have a laser focus where you can just pick out and say, this is going to be a big problem, and then campaign against it is great.
Well, I think that's another really good point, is that we have to be so laser focused. This is sort of section 18 or paragraph 18 of the bill. As you said, there's other stuff there which we're completely agnostic about, and this is also the nature of the battle that we're in. There are so many things that would be very good and very helpful to people that relate to their financial well-being, or to their access to services, or their protection as an employee more generally, and yet sneaked into all of these things. And so politically what happens is that the Prime Minister can stand and say, oh, you're opposing apple pie. You're opposing something that's so obviously good, and yet that's not the point. We're more nuanced than that. We're not saying we oppose everything. It's this part here where you're taking speech rights away, but that gets lost so much in the public discourse. But it's the reality of the way this works on the ground. Is things get sneaked into bills, and amendments then become really, really important. But we should move on, shouldn't we, to another topic, though, Jan, which I think is going to be very close to your heart, because you're an academic, and we're moving to the university world, to the University of Cardiff, in fact, where, there's two stories from Cardiff. The first is it's a sad story that the university has announced plans to cut 400 academic jobs. So this is in the context of, it's a tough financial time, very tough financial time for everybody at the moment, and the academic world is no exception to that at all. And so Cardiff has had to make that decision. But alongside that, what it's done is still doubling down on EDI and still finding time. EDI being equity, diversity and inclusion, or equality, diversity and inclusion. And so now all first year students at Cardiff have to do an EDI awareness module. And it's an online course, and they have to take a quiz to reveal how privileged they are, learn about microaggressions, and how to use inclusive language properly. Now, if you already have, I remember my first week at university, and I remember first time away from home. Am I going to make friends? Is everyone going to hate me? How's it going to be? How does the day work? Where do I go for lectures? When do the lectures start? And I remember the chaplain standing at the front. We used to have chaplains in those days saying, look, I'm here if you need me. This is a tough time, lots of change. And in the midst of that, to have to do a course where you're given this quiz, and then there's a pie chart that tells you your level of privilege, and you're effectively sort of judged. Your whole personhood is judged by that. I think I would have, I'm sure it would have been fine, but I mean, honestly, it's this very odd indoctrination from the word go that's going on in Cardiff. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Jan, given your academic background.
Well, thankfully liberated from that. But anyway,
Yeah.
When I remember when I was doing my PhD, and I then got a job while doing it, back in academia, having been out of academia for most of my 20s. And the first day I walked in and sat at my desk, and I looked up, and on the wall there was a sign that said, do not do unto others as you would wish to be done to yourself. Do unto others as they would wish to be done to. So this is basically the rewriting of Matthew 7:12, which I had to look up.
Well done. Look at that.
I know, but a really profound thing, which is that do unto others as you would wish to be done to yourself, is a statement of a universal sensibility, isn't it? Of we're all the same, and I can understand you, and therefore, as long as I behave well, as I can understand what it means to treat you well, because I know how I would like to be treated. It's the complete opposite of that. And what they've said with the new version, the HR version of the dictum, is you can't assume that you know anything about anybody. And it's this kind of dreadfully brutal severance of the ability to make contact and relationships with people. And the reason I say that is because this is what, if young people haven't already got this in school, which they will,
Yeah.
but they then go to university, and this is, as you say, their first experience. So it's part of the rule book of them understanding, okay, well, how does this new place work? I know I'm more independent and I'm supposed to become an adult through this experience. What does that mean? And whereas I think probably when we went to university, you were very free to kind of work it out, screw it up,
Mm. It wasn't all
act like a
recorded
real
on your
idiot.
iPhone either.
No, I know, but to kind of work through the most ridiculous ideas and arguments and to try them out with people, and ones I remember doing. But now, and of course, you're encountering a much wider range of people than you probably have ever, unless you live in London or something. Imagine kids going from much less diverse places to a university in a city, and terrified, absolutely terrified that you're going to get things wrong, and that you're going into a situation, as if you're a white kid, as a white privileged kid who must profess this and understand it. And the problem is, I think, is this can only breed cynicism and resentment. There's no way this is going to make relationships better between people. There'll be the kids that really get into it and sort of become the experts, and they'll be policing everybody else. But what you'll get is all the others who will stay quiet and don't have an opportunity to question some of the terminology, the concepts that underpin all this stuff. And they will just have this kind of simmering resentment because they won't believe the thing into which they're being indoctrinated.
Yeah.
But they won't. Neither will they have an alternative and a way of challenging it. And the alternative, that they will probably look for alternatives, and the ones they'll find will be the kind of the most resentful areas of the internet, I suspect. And that's what we'll end up with, is this kind of incredibly suppressed resentment between young people of different backgrounds, when actually university could be this great place where you really do get, it's exciting because you meet people from all over the world and from really different class backgrounds, and all of that kind of stuff. All those possibilities are just kind of
And
splatting.
you're so open-minded at the age of 18. You're so accepting of all kinds of different people, all kinds of different perspectives, and you are genuinely going to university to learn about all the different the true spectrum of colours of life. And then to have in your first term, and of course Cardiff is by no means the only institution where this kind of thing is embedded, but to have your own kind of, this is your privilege reflected back at you, simmered down into just a few statistics. This is you. This is who you are. And this is how
Yeah,
you
that's
must
right.
then engage with everybody else around you who also has their simmered down pie chart. And you think that is not how people are, let alone
No.
how people interact and learn and bounce off each other in the way that
Yeah,
university
yeah.
ought to be.
And it's even worse because of course the youngsters that are now at university are the COVID generation,
Mm.
who were very, very isolated. I mean, they didn't have normal GCSEs, didn't have normal A levels. They were incredibly isolated and sort of forced really to socialize through social media, because that's all they had. And so they, even more than anybody else, they need to have a freedom to just make mistakes and have a very forgiving atmosphere where they can, because they all feel weird as it is. They all, they all feel like there's something wrong with them, and yet they've now got to then get there, and then they're told there's even more wrong with them than they originally thought. But I think the other side of this story, as you said, is the cutting of the academic
Mm.
staff. So 400 staff being made redundant. And that includes the music department at Cardiff. And I know so many people who were just couldn't believe that they were shutting the music department, because it's very, very well respected, one of the key
Mm.
places in the country for the study of music. And they're closing it. They're closing modern languages. And, it's this hollowing out of the institution in the most profound way. And it ceases to be a university. You get rid of the kind of excellence. You get rid of subjects that will never be revived, because how can you revive it? Anybody who's passionate about music will have to go elsewhere. If
Mm.
another country is still prepared to teach it, there will be nowhere else. And then you won't have the next generation of lecturers, because they won't be here. And so you end up with these places that basically they've become training places. It's where you
Indoctrination camps, essentially.
they are,
Yeah.
they are. Because if without the substance of the academic teaching and academics who feel free and really morally committed to the relationship to their students, if that's all processed through a bureaucracy of rules, then you don't have a university in any meaningful kind of way in which people can commune around ideas. And so you're left with just a place that's a very, very large and very expensive training ground, residential training ground.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's what this becomes. But then also with this even more negative aspect to it, which is of a kind of seething resentments being brewed for younger people who are paying all this money to be told that they're worthless, basically, because of where they come from and the backgrounds that they have, and that they are victims and they're destined to be victims. I mean, what a dreadful uh, handing over of responsibility to petty rules.
Toby's written a really interesting article on this. He opens in the Spectator. So again, we'll leave a link to this in the Spectator, and he opens with the Cardiff University case, but also kind of moves on to some of the other ways in which these sort of linguistic control affects different kinds of groups. And two things struck me. First of all, he referenced that a lot of these language guides actually also are looking to purge the over 50s who can't quite keep up with the new language and the new ways in which it's being used. So he talks about the inclusive language guide that was published by the Northern Ireland Civil Service. So he's moved on to language guides here. So we started with EDI training at Cardiff. Now he's moving on to language guides. And he says workers were advised not to use age-related language, including young at heart, old school, aged, the aged, the young, the elderly. Look how old I am, by the way. I've got the actual newspaper, the actual magazine in hard print, Jan, because I don't like having it on the digital screen. Also on the banned list were phrases such as love, dear, and darling. And you can easily imagine someone in their early 60s just being hauled before a disciplinary committee. So you've got the older age group, you've got the younger, the students that we've talked about so far, and then the other point he makes is just how quickly things move on. So if you're just getting to grips with the new language and you've learned that BAME means Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, then suddenly the rules are changed again, because of course once you've learned the rules we need to change them, and they're changed because that term can't be used anymore because it excludes groups such as mixed ethnicity, Roma, Irish traveller, and other minority ethnic groups such as Polish or Lithuanian. So the language not only catches the younger people and the older people, or the language guides are more likely to catch the older people. They move on so rapidly. And of course, he then says that, ironically, of course, this affects people who have learning difficulties more than any others. So people who are on some kind of a spectrum are more likely to fall foul of these guides. So in and of themselves, they then become discriminatory. And the best thing is just to get rid of them. Just get rid of all of these language guides. They're not, as you say, I think you described it earlier as the sort of the encoding or the guidelines or the bureaucratic rule book. That is not the way that we live our lives. That's not the way that families work. And likewise, it shouldn't be the way that places of learning, places of where you expand your understanding of life and you expand. You should be growing and getting bigger, not feeling smalling and shrinking, so that your world becomes smaller and smaller because you're being boxed in by these linguistic parameters and by these conceptual parameters as well, going back to the EDI guide at Cardiff. And it just makes your box and your world so small. But I'm a great believer in the human spirit, Jan. I think the human spirit can't box it up, and it will burst out. So I take your point about resentment, and I think it will lead to resentment. But I also know that in the longer term, these things are not gonna hold sway. They're not gonna last because they can't. But they'll always last longer than we want.
I think the problem is when in the formative years of people's early 20s, it is the thing that defines a person for the rest of their lives in some ways, the kind of the world in which you come into in your early 20s. And part of that, that's why university is so important. I mean, when it works as it's supposed to do, it is a way of bringing young people into the world where uh, they learn to express themselves, and it's really difficult. And I know from teaching, so many students, especially British ones, well, in Britain, really struggle just to express themselves in this new academic way, because it's a huge leap from school to university. So they're already tongue-tied about trying to, how do I speak in a way that's not personal to me? How do I discuss ideas that are in a book or somewhere else that are not? It's not just me talking about my own experience, because that's what they're most used to doing. And what we demand of them when we teach them is that they neutralize themselves, and they are able to step outside of themselves. And that's a really brilliant process that people need to go through to become a kind of more civilized person, is you need to learn to put yourself, immediate self, to one side, and to think intellectually in a more objective kind of way. And when you make people so self-conscious about the language, when it's not just how do I step up a level to this more academic, more objective way of speaking, engaging with text that I may not understand, but I need to feel uninhibited about saying I don't understand this, or what on earth is that person trying to get at? Is it this? But if you not only do you have that difficulty, which won't go away, that's necessary, it's the struggle with these other rules about, well, what if I say something in this class, a very diverse class of students, what if I offend somebody? And I saw this firsthand every week, where I would see students who were just tongue-tied. And British students are always a bit like that anyway, compared to, say, Americans, because they're just not used to presenting. They get themselves in a complete tiz about having to speak in public. They think it's the worst possible thing. And this is just a million times worse. It's really, I mean, I can't think of a worse thing to do to young people, to be honest, than this. So although, I'm like you, I'm kind of optimistic, and I think if you squash the balloon, it will pop up somewhere else. But it's a complete waste of an opportunity to have an intergenerational relationship as it should be.
And one
Mm.
point you made, Jan, that I always forget is that point about the COVID reality and the very formative moment. It's 5 years ago now. We're in March 2025. It was in March 2020 that we all shut down. That's 5 years ago. People going up to university, they're 18, so they were 13, 13, 14. What an important age for being out there and making friends and being new experiences, all of that stuff, and that is a factor that none of us had to contend with. So
No.
easy to forget, I think,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
particular one.
Mm. Mm.
Do you have any parish news for us, Jan, this week? I love the fact you said parish news once on an episode, and I thought I'm going to use that one again. It's
Does feel like that.
it's the events slot for anything that's coming up in your particular world.
Yes. So the announcements for the week are, what have we got? So coming up, not this week, the following week is our event on apostasy. So again, every week there's a news story that makes this really relevant. So this chap, back to the Koran burning case we started the podcast with, this chap who was a former Muslim, and who burnt the Quran, exactly people like that. This is where free speech really matters. I mean, obviously people way short of burning a Quran, but nevertheless wanting to talk about their experiences of leaving a very strict or orthodox religion, if they are anticipate being accused of a discriminatory or hate speech or Islamophobia or whatever it is, then that's a very serious threat for their ability to kind of come out, if you like, into the world, the broader world. So that's what we're discussing on Wednesday, the 19th of March. Tickets available if you can get to London. Go to our website and you can find those, or join online. If you're a member, the link is being sent out in our weekly newsletters and other emails, and you'll be able to have a link to join free online. And then there's our Belfast speakeasy on the 11th of April, which will be really good fun. That's a Friday night. It's at the Ulster Museum. We've got Harry Miller, Faircop, Tom Slater from Spiked, and Jenny Holland, who's a Belfast-based blogger. So that's going to be really good fun. They're always great, our events over there. And then I'm working on an event at the moment, which is actually going to take place next week, which is not an FSU event, but FSU supporting it, which is for a much younger audience of like under 30s. Of people in London, where we're going to bring them, have a cross-generational conversation. So we're going to have somebody from each generation on the panel, and we're going to talk about why it is that the generation war is kind of taking hold and what can be done to neutralize it and to reopen dialogue between the generations, because there's a lot of bashing going on between the generations. So we want to have a really free conversation about that. So that should be great. I'm really excited about
I
that.
only have one question on that, Jan. Have you remembered Generation X? Generation X gets missed all the time. It's sort of,
I think that's me, isn't it?
I think that's you. That's me. We're Gen X, but often people go boomers, millennials, Gen Z or Z, and the silent generation, and then Gen X. We're kind of squashed in the middle. But I'm sure you have.
Yeah, well, yes, we that's the one we haven't got, but not because we haven't got ideas for somebody. We will get somebody from Gen X, but yeah, we have got all the others. We've got Ruth Dudley Edwards is our, I guess, silent generation, but she's definitely not silent. So she's on our Northern Ireland Advisory Council, crime novelist, journalist, really intrepid and a very fun person. So that will be she's my recommendation for the panel. So that's good.
Brilliant.
That's it from the Parish Pump.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jan. And thanks again to all of our listeners and our viewers. And we will speak to you all next week.
Bye-bye.